Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Super Feelers podcast. My name is Laurie, and I'm super excited today to be joined by Diana Partington, who is the author of a beautiful book called DBT for Life, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail later on in the show. But before we get into that, I just want to hear a little bit about what brings you to DBT, what brings you to this space.
Absolutely. So I'm very open about this. I was extremely suicidal from the time I was about 5 until I was about 39. And it's so funny. I always think if I had dialectical behavior, for anyone who doesn't know, dialectical behavioral therapy, right? It's
Good call. Yeah.
treatment of choice for suicide. It was originally developed to treat people who are suicidal. And then, of course, Marshall Linehan, the research psychologist and clinician who created the treatment, what she found is that people who have issues with suicide and self-harm have a large crossover with the BPD population. And so that's why DBT has become known as the treatment of choice for BPD. But it's also incredibly effective, really, for anyone who's a super feeler, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who is dealing with really intense emotions, and needs
anybody in the world. I think that every human being on earth should be taught DBT skills from kindergarten on. It doesn't even matter if you struggle with strong emotions.
I know. Literally, I used to specialize in suicidal teens, and the parents are supposed to come to group. And what I found is initially it was usually moms that came to group. And then over time, mom wouldn't be able to come one time and dad would come. And then suddenly dads are coming. And these are CEOs of big companies. These are very very successful men who probably would never be diagnosed in any lifetime. I mean,
yeah,
I'm not saying they don't have issues, but they wouldn't identify as mental health issues. And they love the skills because it's like a manual for how to do interpersonal interactions and manage emotions, even if they're not big emotions. So yeah, I'm totally on that bandwagon of everyone should learn DBT skills.
I use them at work all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I use them to just interact with humans on a daily basis, regardless of whether or not I'm dysregulated. Yeah.
Exactly. And for those of us who are emotionally sensitive, they can be really life-saving. They really can.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I was in a suicidal crisis, and I ended up being referred to a DBT therapist, and I'm so grateful to her because she really saved my life. And I guess the big thing is that I had been through so much therapy. I had done a lot of trauma therapy. I really felt like I had a lot of insight into what my issues were but I didn't know how to behave differently. I didn't know how to handle the pain differently. And I remember thinking when I was in my 20s, I was like, why can't my therapist just have a big box of tools and be like, here's a wrench for that. Here's a special kind of screwdriver. Watch this, a power drill. It's going to change your life. And when I started DBT, I was like, oh my gosh, someone actually
That's exactly what this is.
That's what this is. So I went through DBT as a client, and then I had been a stay-at-home mom for over a decade, and the suicidal crisis came because my husband left me, and suddenly I needed a job. I ended up going to grad school and specializing in dialectical behavioral therapy, and then that's where I wrote my master's thesis on effective teaching of DBT skills for different learning styles, because I have a learning disability. I'm dyslexic, and so I have always been interested in ways that people learn. So I don't know.
That's such a good overview, and it's so clear to me that that's your passion because of how the book is written. So, I mean, I obviously encourage everybody to pick up the book. It's gorgeous, and maybe we'll do a giveaway or something when this episode comes out. But
absolutely, we could do that. And there is it is now available in electronic version, but only
amazing.
So it's much cheaper. It's only $14.99. That is only on Apple Books, though. because
Okay.
there's so many illustrations and pictures in the book. It has to be done as a fixed format, and Kindle is not like
Mm,
that. So we're trying to work that out.
interesting.
But in the meanwhile,
That's good to know because I think in Canada, I can't remember why, but it was like I think just because of the shipping, it was like $70 or something. Um,
$70 on
yeah,
Amazon?
if you tried to buy it in Canada, yeah. So
Oh
I'm
my
really happy to hear that there's a virtual version because it's so amazing. And
God.
honestly, in some ways, virtual is like more accessible for people because like we all have our phones out anyways.
Yeah.
But
That is
I mean,
true.
do you?
And the experience of the book, I think, is really special because
It
there's
is.
something about it that, yeah. And just accessibility is important, and cost $70. That's a lot.
That was when I first looked for it. It
Mhm.
could be different, but I'll send you a screenshot because it might just be like I mean, I'm in Canada, so sometimes things get weird.
Yeah,
But yeah, it was way more expensive in Canada than it was in the States for sure.
interesting.
So virtual is great. And do you want to, I mean, I can explain it or you can explain it like how the book is different than normal dialectical behavior therapy books. Do you want to explain
Yeah.
it?
So, the reason I wrote the book is because I wanted a book that I could give to my clients. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, so Marsha Linehan is a genius, and
Hero.
she's
Yeah.
done incredible work, but her, handouts and worksheets and her teacher's manual, they're clearly written by an academic, and
Yeah.
they're very dry.
And a long time ago. And they're
Yeah,
not beautiful. They're really old.
they're not
Yeah.
beautiful, they're old, and well, the handouts and worksheets particularly are really unapproachable for most people because they
Mm-hmm.
really are meant to be handouts and worksheets that accompany a lecture. Okay.
Right.
So, for people who have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry. Actually, I'm thinking we might even want to cut all of that. Just, you know what I mean? Like, nobody knows what the hell we're
Yeah.
talking about.
You know
Uh,
what? I might be able to even add like a picture of of one of her resources versus one of your resources just to
Awesome.
show the difference. I'll see what I can do because they're so different. And to be fair, I am a very black and white like and like linear thinker. So for me, those her DBT books actually are really helpful because I
That's
loved
interesting.
having homework. But
Yeah.
when I
Yeah.
started reading this, I was like, "Oh my god, this is so much more accessible." Like and even not just accessible, but more interesting because I mean, DBT, I've probably been like practicing the skills for over 10 years. And I find like, there's days where I'm like, I need to get back into my workbook and I open the workbook and then I get bored. Well, I
Yeah.
got like 60 pages into this in like an hour because it was so engaging, which the DBT skills workbooks are not engaging. I mean, I feel like we can just all admit that, right? Like they're
Yeah.
really helpful and they'll save our lives, but they're not engaging. So this is just so
Okay,
different.
so
So
I'm
anyways,
having a lot
sorry.
of
Back to
feelings
how
right
you're doing it.
now. I'm feeling that
Oh,
particular feeling, like I'm getting teared up because
yeah.
it means so much to hear that. I mean, this book was such a labor of love. It took 9 years to
Oh,
create,
wow.
and I really did pour my heart and soul into it. And like you were saying, I mean, I want to hear, actually, I'm so excited to hear your thoughts, and it's just really, really exciting. But yeah, for anyone who sort of is like, what are they talking about? The book is full of color illustrations. It's
Hmm.
full of color graphics. Um, which means it was a very expensive book to produce,
I
and
bet.
print. So what I do is, like, with each skill is I introduce like the skill with just a brief summary. So like someone who's picking up the book, they could just read the summary of the skill and be like, oh, there's a reminder. And
Hmm.
then there's like usually a really beautiful illustration that relates to a short story. So because I learn best from narrative, I wrote short stories that illustrate the use of the skill. So each
I'll
skill,
show an example. Like, look at
there
how
we
beautiful that is.
go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wrote short stories because I like stories. And in each short story, you have a character who's dealing with a really intense problem. And then they apply skills to the situation, and then they have a positive outcome. And I wanted people to be able to go in the journey of what that internal process is like to be using skills, right? Like
Mm.
the way that you're thinking, the way that you're thinking kind of changes, what the real experience of skills use is. And it's been great because the response has been amazing. People have responded really well to the stories. And then, of course, there's a more didactic explanation, like where it's just like, here's what the skill is, sort of fleshed out. And then there's ideas for practice. So my thought was this is, our amygdalas freak out about reading a whole book sometimes, even if you're not dyslexic, right? You got to read this book. Okay. And then you're like, I got to read the introduction, and then I got to blah, blah, blah. What I wanted to do is have a book where you can just literally open the book, see a picture you like the one that you just showed us, right? Mm-hmm. And then be like, I like this picture. I'll read what's on the other page, right? Mm-hmm. And then you read that. And then maybe that's the only thing you read today, right? So what you're doing then is you're tiptoeing around your amygdala. Your amygdala is like, oh my God, your amygdala is like your fight flight center, right? That gets overwhelmed or anxious about, I have to read this book. That instead you can be like, your amygdala is not going to freak out about looking at what's on the other side of looking at a picture, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's probably not going to freak out about reading that page. And then if you get pulled in, maybe you read more, or maybe you put it down and read the next page the next day. Or maybe you end up loving the short stories and reading those, and then skipping the more didactic explanation. Or someone might be like,
you could totally do that, actually. Yeah,
exactly. Or someone might be like, I don't care about the short stories. I just get me to the meat, and just want to read that part. But they will have all the color graphics and there's more illustrations that kind of just keep it easy to read. Is the thing. And I also used really straightforward language. According to Grammarly, this book is written at a 3rd grade reading level. So to be clear,
that's amazing.
Concepts are sophisticated, right? And of course, the language from Linehan, she loves a 50-cent word. She likes those big words. So that the Linehan language is not dumbed down, because I feel like it's really important to be adherent to what she was actually teaching. But all of the rest of the language is really straightforward.
I did notice, though, and maybe I've just been saying this skill wrong the whole time, when you talk about wise mind, I always talk about it as emotion mind and rational mind, but you talk about it as emotion mind and
reasonable mind.
Is that did you change that on purpose, or have I been saying the skill wrong for 10 years?
You have not been saying the skill wrong. I think you have been reflecting from the original book. But did you learn everything from the red and black book, or the spiral bound book?
Spiral bound, I think.
Okay.
Well, to be fair, when I did DBT originally, they just gave us the handouts because it was in in group. So I actually don't know what color. I have the green book at home, which I think is so anyways, there's so many versions, but I guess she changed the language slightly.
I actually didn't change the language, but she did.
Interesting.
In the original, in the black and red book, the first edition of Marsha's book, she had kind of like reasonable / rational mind. And then it kind of just switched into reasonable mind. So people use those interchangeably, and that's okay.
It's funny. I kind of was like, I use rational mind, but I kind of also like reasonable maybe better, because rational is really like no feeling at all. And I don't know if that's really reasonable. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. I was reflecting on that when I was reading it.
Is your audience going to know what wise mind is, what these things are we're talking about?
Probably, but it depends. So wise mind, I mean, you can probably explain it better than me, but it's one of my favorite skills, actually. And it's basically, I think of it as like a Venn diagram of, you have your emotion mind and you have your rational / reasonable mind. And where those two connect, which isn't working very well, is wise mind, which is like the middle ground of both of those things. Is that
exactly? That's a fair
explanation.
Yes, you're very good at this.
It's been a long time practicing how to do wise mind.
To me, like, wise mind is one of the most fundamental skills, because every other skill in DBT is helping you get into your wise mind. And the key feature, because I think when people hear reasonable mind, they're like, well, don't I want to be in reasonable mind? That sounds reasonable. But wise mind reasonable mind is very logic oriented, very focused on consequences and avoiding bad consequences and, thinking things through. But it doesn't take into account emotions. So reasonable mind can lead to analysis paralysis, or it can just
Mm,
be very shouldy, like, well, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. Um, Emotion mind takes into account your emotions. And your emotions are very motivating. Anger is a powerful motivator for change.
yep. So
Love
is
is
anxiety.
a powerful motivator. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
so the idea is that you're honoring your emotions while at the same time you are thinking through consequences. And
Hmm.
so, yes, everything is like, is this my wise mind? Is this my wise mind? Yeah.
Yeah. And I love in the book and just now when you said like, yeah, every DBT skill is helping you get to wise mind. And
Yeah.
I've
Exactly.
never thought about it like that, but it's so true. It's so true. I mean, the distress tolerance, all of those skills are trying to get you out of emotion mind and into that wise mind space. And mindfulness is trying to get you into that place as well. And like, there's just so much
And your
connection between
interpersonal
the
skills.
skills.
Do you know what I mean? Like when you
Yeah.
become mindful of what you're doing interpersonally, it helps you make wise mind decisions about how you're going to
Yeah.
communicate.
Yeah. Like, Dear Man, perfect example of that. You're having to
Exactly.
sit down and think, how am I going to communicate what I want? And to begin with that, what do I actually want? Which I feel like is
Yes.
actually the most important part of Dear Man is like sitting back and going, okay, so now I have to figure out what I do want. And that's
I
not
know.
easy. Yeah.
I love that you said that because so Dear Man, right, is the formula for increasing the odds of getting what you want. So we have this
Yeah.
formula that starts with describing just the facts of the situation to help orient the other person to what your perspective is, and then you express your feelings, like your actual emotions about the situation. You assert what you want, and then you provide a reinforcer of like what's the benefit to the other person for helping you, for doing what you need, or accepting your no. And what is often the case is that people don't actually know what their assert is. They don't
Yeah.
really know what they're asking for, and they're kind of hoping the other person will figure it out. Like, I want you to
Mm,
respect me. Well, like, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like
yeah.
behaviorally to you? And you're like, I don't know, just that they're treating me with respect. But that person like might I live in the South. And so like people from the North, like Yankees, right? People from I'm actually originally from California. People from New York, people from like an Italian family in New York, they're going to think they're being very respectful, but to a Southerner, like the
Mm,
volume and the speed with which they're talking is disrespectful. Is that like
right.
there's like a whole thing of like,
Yeah, it's
it
culture.
it's culture. And so I might think I'm being respectful because of my culture, but in your culture, that's not respectful. And so
Hmm.
when you ask behaviorally, say, hey, I need you to like lower the volume and slow down a little bit and not interrupt me.
Yeah.
That's a behavioral thing that to one person might mean respect, right?
Hmm.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
figuring out what it is that you want. So sometimes I tell people like make a deer, and then if you abandon the whole deer, at least you'll know what you want, right?
Yeah. I do that all the time. Actually, that's how I use Dear Man. 90% of the time is I write letters to the person that
Yep.
most of them are never sent. But what they do is they allow me to think through what those pieces are to myself.
Yep.
And it's almost, I guess you could consider it kind of journaling, but
Yeah.
it's really helpful to have a formula of like describe, okay, well, what are the actual facts? Not how I feel like the facts might affect me or why I don't like them.
And not my opinions, right? And that's the
Yes.
thing. Is it's like, okay, what it's always that thing of like, what are my opinions based on? Right. So that you're like,
Yeah.
okay, here are the actual like tangible facts. And then I have opinions based on those facts. And now I'm going to present you with those facts just so we're working with the same deck. And then we can have different
Exactly.
opinions about those facts.
Yeah,
And that,
and you did a really good job of actually explaining dialectic, which maybe we can talk about a little bit because that in itself is a complicated concept. And
oh,
let
that's
me
my
just say
favorite.
that I highlighted this specifically. Dialectical thinking recognizes that two opposing truths can be true at the same time, and I think that's part of why the dear in Dear Man, like the describe in Dear Man, is so important because your truth might be very different than my truth. And if we're assuming that our truths are the same, we're probably not going to get anywhere.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Do you want to explain dialectic as a concept?
Oh, I love doing that. I love doing that. So
Go for it.
if anyone listening has not heard this term before, dialectics, right? Maybe you can put that in the thing so they can, because people are like, what the hell
Yeah.
are they saying? What is that word?
Yeah.
It's not diabolical. It's not dialogue. It's dialectics. And it comes from dialectical philosophy. And the crux of it, the basic root of it is the idea that two opposing things can be true at the same time, which is the opposite of black and white thinking. So
Mm.
when we get caught in black and white thinking, we're like, I'm worthless, or you could be like, no, this proves that I am great, but this proves that I'm worthless, or this proves that my partner's a jerk, or this proves that they're wonderful. This proves that my relationship is terrible. This proves that it's the best relationship, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to do with dialectical thinking is instead of like swinging from one to another or getting trapped in one, we hold that both things can be true at the same time. It can be true that there are aspects of the relationship that they suck, and there are aspects that are great. They can be, and it obviously, because we would never say that you're worthless or you're the best, right? We're just
Mm-hmm.
like, we can hold that, like, right now you don't feel good. And there are other times that you do feel good. And even miraculously, I mean, I don't know if you've ever had this where you have two completely different things going on in your life, and one of them is amazing and the other one is terrible. And so you're in this weird place of where, like, well, I feel really happy and really sad at the same time.
Yep.
And that's
I know that
okay.
feeling very well at the moment.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So And
Yeah.
I feel like to me what happens when people learn about dialectics is they go from never having heard the word to throwing it around like they invented it. Because
Mm.
they're like, that's so dialectical. That's so dialectical. Right? When you're like, and it's great too, because it can get you out of any argument. Is if you're like, I can see your opposing viewpoint.
Yeah.
Right. We can
That's your
be
truth, but this is mine. Yeah.
yeah, and both of those can coexist in the same world. And then we can
Mm-hmm.
kind of look for what's the synthesis, where's the common ground? Where's the space that allows for both of those truths? Anyway, and
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite dialectics is for someone who's struggling with suicidal ideation. Most people who are struggling with suicidal ideation actually want to live, but they also want to die.
Right.
That's a dialectic, right? And the synthesis is they don't want to live with this much pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that.
I haven't heard that before, but it's so true. I mean, I don't know about you, but I still struggle with suicidal ideation most of the time. And like, I love
Mm,
my life. I have a great life. I
yeah.
I have no desire to end my life, but it's the kind of like first thing that comes up when anything goes wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like it's not the easy way, but you know what I mean? It's like, it feels as though it's like my like solution, which it's not, because that would ruin all the other great stuff that happens in my life. But
You know what
yeah,
I
that's so
think this is
interesting.
my way I think of it is that I think for people who have persistent suicidal ideation, which I did have pretty much from when I was 5 until I was 39,
Mm-hmm.
40, when I went through DBT, that did change. That a combination of DBT, psychodrama, and EMDR made a huge, that sort of cocktail made a huge difference. But I thought of it almost like white noise. You know,
Yeah.
white noise, like that noise that's in the background, and you don't notice it a lot of the time, right? You know, like when your air conditioner is working, your ears are not tuning into it until something happens, and then you're tuned in. And I feel like for a lot of people with persistent suicidal ideation, it's literally like white noise that's just going on in the background,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not paying attention to it until something bad happens. And then when something bad
Totally.
happens, boom, you can hear it and it gets really loud. Because
Yeah.
it's a lever where you can pull the escape hatch, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I do have control. I do have a way out of this. And
Mhm.
and sometimes that can make the present more tolerable. It's just such a dangerous way to make the present more tolerable.
Yeah, and the beauty of DBT is that there's so many other levers that you can pull. The issue is
Exactly.
remembering those levers when you're in that state. And
Yeah.
you say it in the book, we all know it. If you've done any sort of skills-based work, you have to practice when you're not in that place because it
Mhm.
needs to become muscle memory essentially. Like, I played piano as a
Exactly.
kid. If you can't do it from memory, you're not going to do it when you're distressed. Which is what I think is so wonderful about these like kind of new ways to learn dialectical behavior therapy skills is that even if, for example, like I'm not a storytelling person. Like I don't read fiction. Like it's not interesting to me usually. But
Interesting.
these stories I think will, and I actually really enjoy these stories, which I didn't think I was going to be honest, which is kind of
Oh,
funny.
tell me about that. I'm so interested to hear about that.
I was like, like I have my own examples. It's fine. Like I don't, I don't, the stories are just like, they're great for some people who like are really into that kind of thing, but I'm like not like that at all. And I still thought that they were really engaging. And what I loved is that, I think for me and for many others, you're going to you can think about the story maybe before you can think about the skill itself, right? Like this
Yeah,
will stick with people more than the worksheet where you're like trying to, I don't know, do a pros and cons list or whatever. You're going to think about, well,
absolutely.
when this person went through this situation and she was doing her pros and cons, that's what it looked like for her. That's going to trigger me to remember about pros and cons.
And that is like, we learn from these emotional journeys, right? So like you're going to
Mhm.
remember it because you had an emotional experience with the skill. And that I think is the key with the storytelling. So the genesis of the book was really I teach using stories, right? When I'm running DBT
Right.
groups, my skills training groups, I teach using stories. And I had a clinical supervisor who she was like, you really need to write those down and make them into a book.
Mm.
And so I started writing them down, and I really enjoy writing. So I started writing them down, and then it sort of becomes this whole thing. But it did start with, because like the Barracuda story,
Yeah.
like all of my clients have heard me tell the Barracuda story like since time immemorial, and people are just like, yeah, what they say is they're like, well, what are your barracudas? So barracudas are like
Mm.
the things that you're afraid of might happen. The probability of them are so low, but you're putting
Yeah.
yourself in danger trying to avoid them. Right.
Yeah.
And so that story, but I guess those kind of things, I think they help you remember the skill of like, of using mindfulness
Yeah,
about
being in the present and not, yeah, for
future.
context, the story is that this woman is swimming and she's afraid of these barracudas. Is that what they're called?
Exactly.
Yeah, I've never even heard of that before, to be honest. But anyways,
Barracudas are like
don't think.
big fish with very sharp teeth.
Okay,
That's the
well, I mean, I could see that by the pictures, but I don't think we have those up here. Anyways, she's swimming and really panicking about these barracudas that may or may not attack her, and it gets to the point where like she could be so panicked that she drowns because of the potential fear or the potential that these things attack her, when realistically they're not going to attack her and she is able to get to shore and they don't attack her.
Yeah,
And it's a
exactly.
very like great example of not panicking about the future or worrying about the past and being like, am I being attacked currently? No. Okay,
No,
perfect. I'm going to continue to swim then because I don't want to drown.
yes, exactly. You totally get it, Laurie. This is really sweet. And I actually really love that you said this, because most of the people that I've met, like, they're thirsty for the stories. And I love
Funny.
like, new people like you exist, where like the story
Yeah.
is not going to be the main attraction. That that
No.
so if the stories aren't the thing for you, then what is it that drew you to the book without the stories? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in new ways to explore dialectical behavior therapy skills,
Mhm.
and really some sort of a reminder. Because I mean, so for example, we have peer support. It's called the Super Feelers Club. That's kind of where this podcast came from, and
Mhm.
we talk about DBT skills in there all the time. And one of the skills, like, you just kind of get your own toolkit, right? You take this list of however many skills, I don't even know how many skills are in DBT, and then you pick the like 10 that you use on a regular basis. So for me, it's like wise mind, dear man, mindfulness ish, even though like you mentioned in the book that you were really resistant to mindfulness at first. There's a few others. I can't remember off the top of my head. But what was so amazing about doing peer support was that people were bringing up skills like the tip skill or the fast skill. And I went, my God, I had completely forgotten about that because I'm not practicing the skills that I'm not remembering. And so what I try and do on a somewhat regular basis, and not enough, mind you, is I go through the skills and go, I totally forgot about this one. Let me see if maybe now I'm in the right place to learn the skill and have it benefit me. Because my current, dear man, wise mind, and radical acceptance for me when I was first going through DBT were necessary, like just given the circumstances of my life. Nowadays, they're still incredibly important and I use them all the time, but they're not as vital because I am able to have those conversations and have that acceptance without actively writing the Dear Man acronym and that kind of thing.
Right.
But
yeah,
tip,
absolutely.
like, we all know, like, if you're thinking about self-harm, hold on to ice cubes, blah, 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 blah. And I would always be like, yeah, for sure. But then I started hearing all these people in peer support being like, I use this every day, or I have child ice packs in my freezer because then they don't melt in your hands and then it's not messy. Or sometimes if I get desperate, I use frozen chicken nuggets, like whatever it is. And so we would be having these conversations and I'd be like, my God, I haven't been practicing this skill because I totally forgot that it existed. And so I try to relearn them, but I find that I get bored of, bless Marcia. She said, like, I think of her as my number one hero. But yes, her books are not engaging. And I love that there's, this book and I might get the title wrong, but DBT for neurodiversity or something.
Neurodivergent DBT book. Yeah.
Yeah, both so helpful to have just like even color on a page, right? I mean, it sounds so silly, but I'm just trying to pull up like a good example. But like,
have you seen the Game of Real Life card deck?
Yes. Okay. So that I have, and that's what I use that actually to remind myself of the skills.
It's so fun. Literally,
I love it.
My advanced DBT group, we did that last week. Like we played the game and it was so fun because they have these conflict cards, right? Where like the situation, there's like
I'll pull it up. Hold on while you talk.
Yeah. So I'm like
literally, it's right here. Like how fast is that? That's how.
It's so awesome that you discovered it too. Because so what we did is someone would read their conflict card, and then everyone has a hand full of different skills, right? And then they would pick one and pitch it to that person as the way that they should solve their problem using this skill. And it was fantastic because they're really well written. It's really well done. And it gave everyone such a great skills refresher, right? To be
totally.
And then it's like a whole new way of using that skill that you might not have thought about before. And there's also a lot of hilarity ensued. Just have to say.
Yeah, I bet. It's funny, I've actually never played the game. I just use them as reminders for skills.
Oh, you should keep do it at your super feelers.
I know. I keep so wanting to, and then I never have. But like, I mean, and the other, like, again, beautiful imagery of just like really simple overview of the skills. And that's what drew me to your book is that, I love these. Don't get me wrong. This is amazing. And actually during COVID, I did a Instagram series where I would go through a skill a day and just talk about it. And it was really helpful. I think that having some sort of visual and some sort of different explanation can really help remind us to use skills that we don't remember. Absolutely. Because they're not part of our go-tos. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. That's one reason I love that card deck. Cause I feel like that, I wish I'd thought of it but
it's brilliant.
Nice is I don't have to think about it because it exists. Right. And to me, that's okay, now we have another tool to make DBT skills accessible. Right.
Yeah.
And that creativity and something being really well done is just amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because this book, your book, has inspired a series that hasn't started yet, but will be starting probably right after this episode is aired, where a bunch of people in the Super Feelers Club bought the book and were like, "Oh my God, this is so different than how DBT is normally taught," right? Because most of us have gone through DBT or have experience with the skills. And so because of how different it's taught, we're actually doing a recorded mini session for each of the skills. And we're going to just talk through what this means. I think there's 4 or 5 of us, I think, from Super Feelers Club that are going to come together and just go like, okay, so let's start with the stop skill. Well, what does this mean to you? How does this come about? How do you practice it? Do you practice it? Why don't you practice it? And I'm really excited for this series because I think it has the ability to, like, you know, use your book as kind of inspiration for talking about these skills and making it accessible for people who maybe aren't into books or can't afford a book or whatever it is.
And you know, what I call that is DBT stories. Sounds like, you know, if people are sharing like, oh, how do you use the stop skill? Then someone is going to share a story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a DBT story. Anytime someone tells a story of using a skill, so that's really exciting because that's literally how all the stories from the book came about, is like DBT stories that we talked about people's experience.
Oh, that's so cool.
That's
yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And I appreciate you for bringing the book into our lives so that we have this. I mean, you know, we could have done it with other books, but we didn't. And so this kind of inspired the series of let's go through them one-on-one and chat through them.
I love that. I really wanted the book to be something that people like actually look forward to spending time with. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That it's kind of yummy. One of the best compliments I've gotten was a therapist sent me a photograph of her client's copy of the book that was just full of like Post-it notes and bookmark tabs and notes, and
Nice.
She said that this young woman had told her she didn't want to read a book because she doesn't read, and the therapist was like, just give it a try. And then she came back with her book all marked up, and I was like, that
amazing.
Just like write in it, use it, you know what I like, really use it. So that's really good. We are also doing a podcast. We're going to do a podcast called DBT and the Dharma, because so many of our skills from DBT come from Buddhist psychology. So the Dharma
is so cool.
The Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha, which, you know, we're talking about secular Buddhism, right? The Buddha's main focus was how to reduce suffering in this life. And so Marsha Linehan, who created DBT, she went through this whole process of trying to find a solution for her own agony, right? She is been out and proud about having been diagnosed with BPD herself, and that she created the treatment when she was looking for the treatment for what she was struggling with. And she's a deeply spiritual person. She's a, you know, devout Catholic and a Zen Roshi. And what I've come to believe is that the process she went through of taking concepts from Buddhist psychology, from Buddhism, and translating them into something measurable, scientific language that wasn't going to have like the stickiness of spirituality on it. So that it could be an evidence-based treatment, which it is. There's a lot of research showing the efficacy of DBT. And I think she made it ironclad because of the stigma around BPD, so that no one could tear her down. Right. I mean, and in fact, I've actually heard prominent people in the field tear her down because of the BPD. But I just
really,
you don't get to do that because it's evidence-based, which I think is what her goal was, is my assumption. But she talks about in her memoir how she took these concepts from Buddhism and she did the same thing that Jon Kabat-Zinn was doing at Harvard. So at Harvard, Jon Kabat-Zinn was translating Buddhist concepts into like more tangible language where he developed mindfulness-based stress reduction initially for
Okay.
like physical pain management. But what the DBT and the Dharma podcast is going to do is it's going to deconstruct. We're coming back to the actual Buddhist teachings that are underpinning so many of the DBT skills. And it's so wonderful to do because it, like you said, like another way to access skills, another way to like kind of understand them. And so like one of the things that I learned from Madeline Finn, who I'm doing the podcast with, who's a Dharma teacher, Dharma facilitator, he said that she talked about anchors. So for mindfulness, you know, like a lot of people who have had a lot of trauma, sitting and following your breath makes you dissociate. And so it feels like meditation is kind of off limits as a way to train the mind. But what Maddie pointed out is that all you need is an anchor. The breath is simply an anchor. So if you're someone who's like, well, I do want to be able to train my attention. I want to be able to take my mind, you know, like when I'm at work and I'm thinking about why my boyfriend hasn't texted me, I want to actually be focused on work, not on the text, right? That's pretty wise mind to want to do, but it takes mind training to do that, right? And so the idea is that anything can be your anchor. So if your anchor, like literally sometimes my adorable cat Beans is my anchor. So like I'll just be like, okay, I'm just going to pat him and look at him. And when my mind wanders to something else, I'm going to bring my attention back to him. Wanders, bring it back. And so like one of the characters in the book, she uses her swimming practice as her mindfulness practice. So
And
her
I do that
mind,
too.
you do that too?
So in your book, I went, oh my God, this is like speaking to me so much, as I actually find swimming to be incredibly mindful because it's stroke, 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 breath, stroke, stroke. And I can do it for an hour. I mean, obviously my mind wanders, but I can always come back to where I need to be because it's physical.
But that's the thing too, is like every time you notice your mind wandering, that's you actually doing meditation. If you were able to just focus on your breath or just focus on stroking and breathing, right? Then that's not really doing anything. Does that make sense? If it was easy. But the trick with mindfulness is that mindful awareness that your mind has wandered. And then be like, mind wandering, friendly, 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 bring it back to the swimming.
Yeah, non-judgmental about it and coming back.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that those tangible things are really helpful for mindfulness because I hated mindfulness so much when I first started it. And it was like not doable for me because my brain was so distressed that sitting in my thoughts sitting in anything in silence was not safe or comfortable for me. But now I've gotten to the point where, you know, every Friday I do yoga nidra, which is 20 minutes of a guided meditation that is changing my life. It's beautiful. And I can sit and breathe, and I do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 skill and like all of these other mindfulness techniques. But it's about finding the one that works for you as opposed to going like, well, I need to sit here and breathe, do box breathing. It's like, that might not be.
Exactly.
That doesn't have to be it, right? There's so many other options for mindfulness.
That's what I love about DBT skills too, is there's so many options, right? So that if you're like, bah, I don't feel like doing that skill, or that skill's not for this situation, right? It's just, it's really always just about doing what's effective, and everyone's different. You know, everyone's different.
Yeah. So I'm curious if we want to get into, your book doesn't talk a lot about borderline personality disorder specifically, which is all good. I mean, the whole purpose of this podcast is kind of, as much as borderline personality disorder is something that I identify with and was really important to me to have a diagnosis. And I actively will be breaking down the stigma of that diagnosis for the rest of my life. I also want to make sure that this podcast is inclusive of people who don't identify with that diagnosis, but would still benefit from these conversations. It seems quite intentional how little borderline is talked about in the book. And I'd love to hear why.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you're bringing this up because I had been wanting to ask you about this. Given that we're so dedicated to the Bold, Beautiful Borderline podcast, which is such a great podcast, and
Thanks.
you brought so much love to it. And I'm always in favor of anything that is destigmatizing BPD because I'm going to just give you my little spiel about BPD. Because most of my clients have been diagnosed with BPD, and some of them identify strongly with that diagnosis and it's helpful for them. And for some people, they're like in shame and shame spirals about it. And the stigma that comes around it has been very damaging for them. And so what I like to talk about is emotional sensitivity.
Yeah.
Is I'm like the root of BPD is emotional sensitivity. And Marsha Linehan says that 10% of the population of humans is emotionally sensitive. 90% are not emotionally sensitive. And all that means is that we feel our feelings more intensely. And it's measurable. Like you can hook up, like if you hooked you or me up to sweat monitors and brain monitors and all that stuff, and you give us the same text message that somebody else gets that's not emotionally sensitive, our bodies are going to react much more intensely. Like you're going to be able to measure the intensity of the emotion, and it's going to be a lot higher. For those people, someone might have to have died to have that level of intensity, right?
Yep.
And it is, I think it's one of the reasons a lot of people with BPD or emotional sensitivity handle crises more effectively because like, oh, I'm always living at that level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my boss the other day, today I took a mental health day because I was not doing super well. And I messaged my boss, who is a beautiful human being and I love her to bits. And I messaged her and said like, hey, you know what? My mental health is shot. Like I need a day off. I'm sorry. And she went, how do you hide it so well? And she's like, it's a blessing and a curse, isn't it? And I was like, it's 20. I mean, I'm 30. I've been practicing hiding how emotional I am for about 30 years. And I have a lot of skills that help me kind of face conflict and stress and just like the show must go on. Right. And that's not necessarily the best way of doing it. But yeah, I mean, we live in so much chaos that chaos becomes normal and we can deal with it really easily, which is amazing.
Exactly. So there's a superpower in being a super feeler.
There sure is.
There is superpowers. So, like the superpowers of being a super feeler is increased compassion, passion, experiences of joy, creativity, intuition. I mean, there's so many good things. And the downside is the depression and the anger and the jealousy and the, fear of abandonment, all that kind of stuff. And so the thing with DBT skills is they're meant to address those things and make all of that more manageable. But back to the BPD thing, right? So, so a lot of my clients identify as BPD or have been diagnosed with BPD. And so, other therapists will be like, how do you deal with those borderlines? And I always like to remind people that because you have to have 5 of 9 criteria, diagnostic criteria to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, first of all, those are highly subjective criteria. Chronic feelings of emptiness. What does that even mean? Yeah, you know exactly. What I mean? Like people who've experienced it know what it feels like, know what that is. Yeah. But it's very subjective. And you have to have 5 of 9, which mathematically means that there's over 250 presentations of BPD.
Yep. 256, I believe.
There it is. And that is a lot of different presentations. And in my personal experience, I can't vouch for anyone else, but my experience has been that BPD clients are the most motivated clients you will ever meet. Yeah. They are in so much pain. And if you can give them something that actually works, it's like sponges. Clients with BPD
we're desperate for it.
Absolutely. Because people want to feel better, right? Yeah. They want to feel better. And they don't want their lives to be chaotic. My struggle has always been when someone has the co-occurring disorder of like BPD and substance use disorder. That that's really hard, and I'm not particularly good at that. But you're just like straight up like suicidal, depressed, emotionally sensitive person. I love working with people, these clients,
Yeah.
because they are so motivated, and they're usually hilarious and compassionate,
Always.
and
Yeah.
like, I mean, we're just talking about really actually fantastic clients. And it's just like having the toolbox that is going to be helpful. I know I have a client who she's always like, when are you going to talk about me in one of these things? So I guess this is the big moment.
Woohoo! Go client, go.
Without any identifying information, this young woman was referred to me when I was a baby therapist. Like, I'd just gotten out of grad school, and she was in a really bad place, and she was self-harming in very secretive, very painful ways, and like sort of exceptionally shocking ways that she was self-harming. And I was like, girl, like, you got to stop that. I was like,
right.
don't do
first thing, don't do that.
Just don't do that. And I was trying to use a technique that Marshall Linehan teaches called door in the face, where you're going to ask for something that you'll never get. Like,
right.
What client is going to walk into your office that's been self-harming their whole life, and you're going to be like, yeah, don't do that. And they're going to,
I had never thought of that before.
Right,
exactly.
This is what she says, because 10 years later, she has not self-harmed.
Wow.
Because she says, well, nobody ever told me not to. And I was like, oh. And I ended up telling her, when she was referred to me, I was told that the psychoanalyst that she had been seeing previously had actually presented about her at a conference about how she was untreatable. And she said that her experience of seeing him was she felt like he was just sitting there judging her the whole time and not giving her anything directive to help her change things. And in fact, she was probably the most treatable client I've ever had, because she did not want to feel this way anymore. And she was just like, please help me learn how to do things differently. Help me learn how to manage this pain. That's one of my spiels about BPD, is just like so many different presentations that you can't just say borderlines, like as though that's one presentation. And I guess actually we were talking about this. Should I bring it up now? Because it was insensitive.
Yeah, sure. Just the amount of stigma.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a new book that came out. I have not read it yet. I ordered it. It's supposed to be here today. But 2 days ago, I saw the review in the Wall Street Journal. It's called Borderline Biography of a Diagnosis. And this review, oh my gosh, this woman, what does this woman say? She says the psychiatrist who reviews the book brings up fatal attraction, bunny drowning, talks about borderlines, her word, not mine. I always talk about people who've been diagnosed with BPD, or I just talk about emotionally sensitive people.
Person first language. We are not a disorder. We are a human that is suffering with a certain thing. Yeah.
She's like, borderlines are manipulative, toxic people. Like, I'm not quoting exactly. What she was saying was,
I bet you are, pretty much.
It was so inflammatory, all of the language. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, a mental health professional is doing this. It just, it's very upsetting. It's really upsetting.
Yeah.
So, Marshall Linehan wants to get rid of the diagnosis. She wants to change it, and call it emotion dysregulation disorder. So that it's talking about what the actual problem is. The actual problem is emotion dysregulation. And then what do you do to help people manage emotion dysregulation? And then that presumably wouldn't have the same level of stigma. But I just like to talk about emotional sensitivity. And my experience has been, for most people, they find that really validating, because it's not saying you're a bad person, you're a crazy person who boils rabbits.
Yeah. You have a personality disorder, which is also flawed. It shouldn't be a personality disorder anyways, but that's another that's a discussion for another day. But
It's
yeah, like, I mean, I was talking to someone the other day, I think it was my stepmom maybe, about, you know how at work sometimes they'll do like personality like
Mhm,
tests, and then they'll like,
mhm.
and I was saying, she was saying that it was really like interesting for her, whatever, she was doing one. And I was like, I've had to do one before. I literally got so just so like, I had so much shame because
Mm,
I was like, my personality is flawed. No matter
mm.
what this personality test shows, I'm going to come back as I'm a fucked up person.
Oh, honey.
And I just bawled and bawled. I know we had to do it at work. It was mandatory. And
Yeah.
I just, and it was such a like realistically, like kind of a stupid response to like a thing that had nothing to do with personality disorders, but just the word personality disorder is like, you're a flawed human being at your core.
Yeah. And
And
I
that is
think,
not true.
Lori,
We're
that makes
actually,
sense though. I mean, if you're
yeah,
like, if you've been diagnosed with BPD, right? So you have a personality disorder, and then you're going to take a personality test at work, even though it's not a diagnostic test, it would make sense that you would be
yeah,
like, oh, my secret fuck uppery that I have worked so hard to present I've got my shit together, I'm organized, I'm a good person, and like, oh, now I'm going to be found out because this test
yeah.
is going to see something about me and reveal something about me that I've worked so incredibly hard to heal and take care of. And oh, that's so vulnerable. It's so vulnerable.
Yeah. And the thing about the diagnosis, and I should say, I am the kind of person who this does, getting the borderline personality disorder diagnosis was the best thing that ever happened to me. So I am not an anti-diagnosis person. I am not a like anti-borderline person.
Mhm,
What
mhm.
I am though is like, we need to reduce stigma. The stigma is absolutely atrocious and completely unnecessary. And there's so many positives to having borderline personality disorder or strong emotions and being a super feeler that are not considered in any of these diagnostic criterias or the stigma. But also, the diagnosis is only as valuable as it is to the person who receives it. And
Yes.
they get to decide whether or not it's valuable for them. My master's research was on borderline as well, shocking. And I talked a lot with the participants around what their diagnostic process was. And I mean, the amount of people I've heard through my research and through like podcasting and just having friends with
Mhm,
borderline, the amount of
mhm,
people who are the diagnosis is hidden from them because of the stigma is
mhm.
completely unethical to me, because
Oh,
it's
boy.
still on their record. So they're experiencing the stigma of a thing that they're not even being provided the value
Oh,
of knowing.
oh
And it
my gosh,
happens
that
all the
is
time.
so gaslighty, right?
Yeah.
If
And
everyone is reading
people
your
find it
chart,
out years later. Years later, people will
so
find this
everyone
out.
has been reading your chart and looking at you through a certain lens. So
Yeah.
no matter what you do, that lens, if they weren't looking at you through that lens, they might see it very differently. But because they're in that,
Yeah.
oh, she's the borderline, that
Yeah.
that business, then you're perfectly valid, perfect. Like Marsha Linehan tells a story about this that's
Mm.
just so important, I think. But when she was first doing all of her research, she was working in a psych hospital on the East Coast. This young woman was supposed to like have a hearing about being released from this mental hospital, but it
Mm.
was more of like an institution, like a longer, not residential treatment the way we think of it now, but
Yeah.
more like
Yeah.
sort of
Like
old
long,
school.
long, long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was supposed to have a hearing about being released, and she was identified as having been having BPD. Marsha Linehan said she showed up 10 minutes late to the hearing in tears because, and you got to think, like, this poor young woman is trying to get out of a mental hospital, of a mental
Yeah.
institution. It's a big place, and it's one of those old, windy buildings, and she had been misdirected about how to get there. And so she got lost, and then she's frantically trying to find her way to where this meeting is convened. And she knows she's late, and she gets there. And of course, it's a bunch of, male psychiatrists who are like saying, this just shows that you're not ready to go because you're crying and you're late. And it wasn't even you're crying and you're late, but they weren't interested in the story. They weren't interested in
not
understanding why this had happened. Exactly. And so Marsha Linehan went and talked to her. I usually talked to her to find out what, she loves that behavior chain analysis. What was the chain of events? What led to the moment? And when she understood, she was like, anyone would have that reaction.
Yeah.
Anyone under that kind of pressure. That's not a pathology. That is an understandable response to what's happening. And of course, one thing that happens with the development of BPD is often someone having a completely reasonable response, response to an external event and then being invalidated about it.
Yeah.
Or not listened to. And that creates an escalation of emotion and escalation of behavior. And then there's that transaction where then the environment gets more intense about it. And then escalation, and then over time, that persistent invalidation, it's like lighter fluid for emotionally sensitive people, like the fire of emotional sensitivity. You're just like, just throw on some invalidation and bam.
Exactly. And I mean, like to the diagnosis part of that, by not being provided a diagnosis, if you want one, and if it's a valid diagnosis, you're being invalidated because you're basically being told you're crazy and you are distressed, but we're not going to tell you why, or we're not going to give you the benefit of finding other people like you. Like the amount of people that reach out, to me in particular, like saying you're the first person that I've ever heard has borderline.
Oh my gosh.
And that's so sad. And it's so common because we're taught to live in this ridiculous amount of shame that why would we ever come forward? And if we don't come forward, again, it's everybody's personal decision whether or not they come forward with their diagnosis. But my belief is that the more people that come forward, the less the stigma will be there, right? Because you'll realize that everybody, 1% to 2%, some people say up to 5%, whatever. And so the more people that can say like, this is my experience, even if it's not using the words and saying I'm a super feeler, I'm a highly sensitive person, whatever, it is actively breaking down stigma. And like, it's a cycle, right? You think about the people that aren't provided diagnoses when they're in a hospital, and then they find out that they have a diagnosis, and then they go like, are you freaking kidding me? Why didn't you tell me this before? And then the providers go, see, you're overreacting. You're abusing your healthcare staff. And it's like, well, no, that's a completely valid question to ask, but they're not ever going to have that response from somebody that they didn't tell or that they didn't diagnose with BPD. Anyways, it's a cycle.
I'm thinking like from a dialectical perspective, right? I 100% agree with you that it's not ethical. Dialectically, this is how dialectics work, right?
Yeah.
I could see a rationale of thinking that you're protecting the client. Do you know what I mean? That like,
yeah.
And I guess this is the reason that what you're doing is so incredibly important, because if you don't have to be protected from it, no one has to lie to you about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If the fear is that if you know that you're being diagnosed with that, you're going to, and actually this is what I was originally thinking is before DBT, there was no known cure for borderline. There was no treatment. And so you can kind of understand why someone wouldn't want to tell someone about, you have this thing that's untreatable. Because what's the function?
You're already suicidal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the function of a diagnosis is to figure out the right treatment. That's the function. So if there was no treatment, then you get this like bad habit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I can see that. That makes sense in the 90s.
That makes sense in the 90s.
In 2024, like the thing is if you Google borderline treatment, DBT is going to show up. And that is a blessing to the person that's Googling that.
You know how many
If
people
they
I have gotten who have been referred for ECT before they were referred for DBT?
No.
Mhm. People have been referred for electroconvulsive shock therapy to treat their suicidality, which is not a treatment for. It's treatment for like really bad depression, is not a
Yeah.
treatment for suicidality. And they get referred into DBT as like a last ditch effort. And I'm like, how, when someone is diagnosed with suicidality, when someone is presenting with suicidality, what I don't understand is how DBT, or, I heard about that another treatment, and I can't remember the name of it. Why does everyone have to have names for treatments that are so complicated?
Oh, yeah. Is it the one that I talked about on the podcast?
Yeah, on the beautiful borderline.
Deconstructive psychotherapy or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, why not be pointing people towards evidence-based treatments for suicidality? And it doesn't have to be, Marsha Linehan is like, DBT is not the be-all end-all of treatments, which is one thing I love about her. She's like, if the treatment's not working, it might be that it is not the right treatment for the client, or it might be that it's not being delivered properly by the therapist. One way or another, something else might be better. Although the heartbreaking thing she says is, or it might not have been invented yet, the thing that the client needs, which totally reminds me of me in high school. I'm like, sometimes I have this fantasy of time traveling back to the 80s with the DBT knowledge I have now and redoing everything. I'm sure other people have that fantasy.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, that's why Marsha created it, right? Is she went, wait a minute, I can't live like this. And there's nothing for me. So I'm going to make something for me. And thankfully she did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's a dialectic here too, is like the work that you're doing about, overcoming the stigma about BPD, and also Marsha's campaign to change it to emotion dysregulation disorder. I think both of these things can be true and valuable at the same time.
Don't get me wrong, I 100% want the name changed. There's nothing about this name that I am personally tied to at all. In fact, I think it's a really stupid name that makes no sense. But in the meantime, let's break down the stigma. And even if it's not of the breaking down the stigma of the diagnosis, but breaking down the stigma of super feelers in general, who people think have like unreasonable reactions to things, but don't realize that when you're actually feeling this strongly, those reactions are completely reasonable.
I know my mom literally said this to me the other day. My mom's 83, and she was like, okay, so I think we've come to understand that I am a minimizer and you're an overreactor. And I was like,
you're like, have we come to understand that? I'm not sure.
I was like, yeah. And dialectically, there's some truth in that, but I'm also like, well, how did I become an quote unquote overreactor? Because I live with because I grew up with a minimizer. Anyway, bless her heart, because the fact that she's able to acknowledge that she is a minimizer is a very big deal. So
totally.
If I need to give her a little ground on the overreact, I'm like, was I really overreacting? Maybe not.
Oh my
I don't know.
That's hilarious. Oh, I love that. My goodness. Well, I have loved every minute of this conversation, and I don't feel like this will be our last. I so appreciate you sharing your own story and your own thoughts on all of this and writing this book. It's completely beautiful. I'll obviously link it in the show notes. And we'll be having those, I don't know what I'm going to call them yet, but like skills talk sessions when we're going to talk about each of the skills on the podcast as well. So
DBT, you know what? You could call it DBT stories if that's what you're doing.
I don't want to take that away from. When you said it, I was like, that's brilliant.
No, you should totally do that, because I think anyone can have DBT stories. You know what I mean?
It's true. Yeah. And we'll see how it kind of like comes out. You know what I mean? Like it's
absolutely.
I'm so looking forward to it. And maybe when we wrap up that series, you can come and join that little group and we can all chat together. I would love to do that. A little wrap up.
That sounds really fun. That sounds really fun. Thank you so much, Laurie.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Super Feeler podcast. Today's episode was recorded on the unceded and traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me reach more listeners like you, and we're always looking for improving the podcast. Remember, you can always stay connected with me on social media. You can follow us. The show notes will have all of the details for Instagram profiles. If you want to support the podcast and help me continue to bring great content, please consider joining the Superfeeler community on Patreon. Your support really means the world to me, and there's a variety of different options for support, including some free ones. For all information about the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support that we run, including upcoming events and resources, head over to Eventbrite or laurieedmondson.com for more information. And if you have a topic that you want me to cover or a guest you'd love to hear from, please send me the suggestions. Always happy to hear them. Until next time, keep on superfeeling and living authentically. This is Laurie signing off of the Superfeeler podcast.